Some leaders leave footprints, others leave libraries. You're tuning into the Authors on Mission podcast, where industry giants become literacy legends. In every episode, we talk with authors who turn their brilliance into books that transform lives. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission. Welcome to your authorship experience. Hey everybody, welcome to Authors on Mission podcast, where today we are going to dive into real conversations about justice, education, and building stronger communications and communities. I'm your host, Danielle, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Nicholas Bradford, founder of the National Center for Restorative Justice and co-author of A Real-World Guide to Restorative Justice in Schools. Nicholas brings years of experience transforming school cultures through restorative practices, and today we're going to talk all about his life, his insights, his practical strategies for educators looking to make meaningful change, and we have some surprises in store also. So, without further ado, welcome, Nicholas. It's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, it's lovely to be here. Thanks, Danielle.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. Everybody listening right now, Nicholas had just told me he recently moved, so he's kind of in the chaos of unpacking boxes and everything. But, you know, just like most of us, he's able to still find the time to do things he loves, like hopping on podcasts and talking about what really means a lot to him. So thank you so much for doing that and taking the time out for us. It's an honor.
Yeah, of course.
So, yeah, I mean, what's great about what you do, Nicholas, is that you went from being a classroom teacher to leading just a national organization. Being a teacher myself, I know what it's like to kind of transition from sort of the standard role to something completely different. So let's start there. Like what inspired that change? How did it come about? Let our listeners know a little bit about Nicholas and his journey.
Yeah. I'm currently here in Washington State, but when I started teaching, I was in upstate New York and Vermont, working with young people who have some challenging behaviors in alternative settings, both in schools and in alternative setting placements for students who had some really, really challenging behavior that they couldn't be in comprehensive education settings. And so I'm doing that and building relationships with young people who are struggling to kind of meet the expectations of a pretty standard education community. And I ended up having, this is pre-kid, so I had more time and volunteering in the evenings. I volunteered with a community organization in Vermont. In Vermont, every county has a community justice center. And in Vermont, they have both youth and adult restorative systems. And I was volunteering in this setting, meeting young people who had charges, sort of either diversion charges from a prosecutor, or sometimes in Vermont in particular to some restorative systems, but this is a direct police referrals. So police would direct refer to us, and those kids wouldn't get any kind of paper on them. I'm doing this work, and it really made a lot of sense to me. Really sitting down and slowing down these processes of talking about what young people have done that's been hurtful and harmful to the community, real authentic accountability. And we'll get there, what that accountability looks like and sounds like, but it's just an essential part of this work. And that's really kind of what interested me in it. And then the end of the process is this idea of, what do we do now? How do we make things better? And that was really such an interesting idea for me at the time. This is 2009, 2010, when I started getting into this work. And I think about schools and the work that we were doing, and I use that term work a lot in schools, and we talk about the work and like doing the work and putting pen to paper and like showing up and like doing. But in the discipline space, there's no sort of corollary work. And so that was really just like shocking to me in a different way of approaching. And so sometimes kids would just have sort of regular community service hours. But this one student in particular that I found really interesting, and I share this story often, the young man who ran a red light, is, also smoking a bowl, runs a red light right in front of a police officer, and is new to his license, he's got a single dad and he's got a younger brother, right? And so when he loses his license, he impacts not just himself, because like there's some discussion around that, or the risk or the danger and all that kind of things, but like he actually impacted his dad a lot. And so we had a conversation, he and I and one or two, I can't remember if there was two other facilitators there, volunteers with me, but we all had this conversation around like, what's it feel like for your dad? And like, what are you going to do in order to give back? And it was really like just a nice like way to consider who's impacted, how are they impacted, and what this young person, not just the recognition of that, because that's incredibly important, just the recognition of how people have been impacted, like taking responsibility and recognizing how it's impacting other people, but then to put it in their court and say, like, what do you want to do? How are you going to make things better? And so that for me is one of those examples of like, oh, this is a game changer. And so I'm starting to work on like, what are we doing when our schools, in the school setting that I'm working with, and, you know, I think that was sort of some baby steps in that early space in Vermont. I met two people, Dominic Barter and John Kidd, who were like national, international kind of trainers. Got really excited about this work. And then I came back to Washington and got my master's in education policy and has been doing this work since 2012 independently. And then in 2016, founded the National Center for Restorative Justice. Yeah. And then 2021, published the book and kind of making things happen, I hope. But that's my story. That's where I come from. That's how I got to this work. Really thinking about that transition from a classroom teacher into this space. Like this conflict work was just really, really powerful and galvanizing for me from the jump. I think primarily because I worked with kids who were so challenging.
Yeah, so I think one thing I want to point out is that you said, I hope so, when you talked about if you're making an impact. I mean, I think it's pretty clear you have. I mean, your book has been read by countless people, and, I'm sure you hear feedback all the time from people from all the different cases that you work with and everything. I mean, like, let me challenge you. Share an example of a specific case. I mean, you have that one example of the student that you challenged to, think more about, the consequences that are faced by his father. I'm sure you've also get tons of emails all the time from people who read your book or who you've worked with that they tell you about how much it's benefited you. I mean, I'm sure you get them all the time.
Yeah, I mean,
Or maybe that's a challenge that I wasn't.
No, it's certainly I've had a positive impact. It's hard to sort of just sit here and say like, I've had a positive impact, but for sure, like I hear both directly and indirectly. We have good survey information, with our trainings and things like that. And that's primarily what we do is we offer trainings to teachers and educators, both on site, and they come to us, and also we travel a bunch to schools and districts to offer this work. So, yeah.
Yeah. So no matter where you go, I mean, you're leaving an impact, and it's all thanks to the fact that, well, one, you're able to find a passion in this, from your career as a teacher, but also because you have a book out there, like a credible source you can hold and say, like, this is a book. It tells all of the things that I'm preaching here, and there's examples and there are case studies. It's proof, and following this leads to change. So I think that's just like the reason I mentioned that is a lot of our listeners today are thinking about, should I do the same thing as Nicholas? Should I write that book? Right. So you're standing there as living proof that it does make a difference. Now, let me ask you this. When you started this writing process, was it on your own? Did you have a collaboration of people helping you out? Was it a struggle to come naturally?
It's a struggle. I mean, writing is a struggle. But I was blessed to have an amazing co-author, David LaSalle. And David and I actually, so when I first started in 2012, really without a lot of experience, I had a couple years and I did some of my master's looking at sort of restorative justice and gotten some trainings and did a bunch of this stuff. But still, like in comparison to now, I had very little experience. But he was one of the first educators. Actually, he was one of his students who I'm still friends with, Ryan Tone, who emailed me out of the blue, was like, hey, can you come to our school and help and do some training? And so I came to the school for this student who was I want to say a 10th grader at the time. And I meet him and his advisor, David LaSalle, and their principal, Garth Reeves. And these three folks have been in my life for forever. Ryan actually graduated high school and started working for me for a little while before he's an educator now too. He does special ed work. But David, he, I think like you, is a language arts teacher or was, and a poet, and like just has a way with language and words that I don't have. And so from 2012 to 2020-ish, I guess, primarily I did, but sort of in collaboration with David, we were putting this stuff together. This theory, this practice, this strategy in the language of our work, these 5 principles, kind of how our work intersects with equity work. And then during that time also, he had collected some stories from folks who are practitioners. He eventually left Washington, went to Brooklyn, was a restorative justice dean over there at one of the schools, big school out there. And then he spent 2 years out there, and then also left farther east to Bosnia, where he resides now. And so when he was in Bosnia, we collaborated. And so I would make these recordings. We'd, strategize about how we're putting this stuff together, what's our organizational stuff, all that's like via email and calls. And then I would make these recordings and he would write it down, and then we would go back and forth on the editing process. And then we also had a publisher, and their editing process was great as well. So yeah.
Good. I'm glad that you had just like such a strong teammate to collaborate with. I was just talking to somebody, earlier today actually, who, he was also emphasizing how he couldn't have done it on his own, right? Like, he has these insights, he has all these ideas, but without somebody to kind of, bounce those ideas off of and help you structure it in a way that makes sense within the book, or even just like to offer a different perspective on it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's always good to have somebody, whether it be a co-author like him, or I mean, like, for Authors on Mission, we have a team of people that can help you too. I mean, I do angel writing. We also have editors, like you mentioned, but also like, even like marketing services, that sort of thing. It's, you gotta have someone to get your back, whether it's a friend like him or just, a company, whatever it is. It's hard to do it on your own. You can.
Yeah.
But then how much time are you spending learning how to do it, right? Or struggling with it. So it's good that you had him as a partner and ally to do.
I think that's one of the challenges with like our work in entrepreneurship in general is that it can be really lonely. And I think writing in particular is a lonely process. And so I think I do hear that, and I think it's important to consider like what's that team, who's your support people, and who's like there with you. Right? Either as a collaborator or just a support person or somebody on the back end who's trying to get this word out for you. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it extends far beyond just writing to, I mean, going back to, well, we both have in common that we're both teachers and we've experienced what it's like. And, even in the classroom as an educator, you can't do it on your own there either, like, you need that teacher across the hall that you can vent to. You need the child study team to come in and help you out. And you need like, an ear to vent to, whatever it is. So I'm relating it back to the book and the content of that, just as another example. It goes for many different things.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And so, I mean, using that segue back to your book a little bit. So tell me more about, you mentioned that ever since the book came out, you're going to all different schools and giving the trainings. What are some of the key insights that, you usually share during these trainings? I know when I, skimmed through your book a little bit, you talked about the 5 pillars, was it? Or
yeah.
The 5 pillars. I was trying to think how many we had there. Tell me a little bit about those, and, all of our listeners too, how can they perhaps, maybe integrate it into their own lives or consider it for their own perspectives as well? What do you think?
Yeah, so the 5 principles or 5 pillars of our work are these ideas that like we just have to operate from. Conflict happens. Conflict's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. I think that in education, we've really put a lot of downward pressure on conflict. And I think this comes from my own personal life as a son, and how difficult it is sometimes for us in committed partnerships to be in conflict, and why that's hard and why that's bad. So like recognizing that when you put 2 people together for more than 5 minutes, you're going to have conflict. And that's okay. Actually, conflict can be an opportunity for growth.
By nature, right?
Yeah. So conflict happens, engage all stakeholders. So the more people at the table is really important. We separate and isolate authors, victims, or even both authors, people who've been the sort of perpetrators of harm. we separate them. We don't allow them to talk about it. Authors and victims, we separate them. We kind of interview people separately who witnessed it or whatever. Like all this kind of stuff is separating out, and as opposed to a restorative system, which is like, let's bring folks together. Let's all like talk about this together, and then we can sort of move forward. So conflict happens, engage stakeholders, empower the author and the victim. And so thinking about, and I kind of referenced this earlier, empower the author and the victim really means like that authors and victims have a say in the outcomes. Like what is the work that needs to happen? That's really important, that both authors and victims get a say, and they don't get to dictate, but they get a say in how this stuff moves forward. And that increases, because I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and I'm always thinking like, what's that developmental level as well, right? So in high school and in young adults, like there's a lot of agency and a lot of decision making that those people get to do. In your pre-K and early elementary, there's less. There's like, hey, here's a distinct few options, right? This is how we make things better. And my son, we always like, not always, but there's a lot of language in our household around like, do you want to offer comfort to your sister primarily, because that's the person he hurts the most. And he'll ask like, do you want some comfort from him to his sister who's 2? And she says, and she like, well, kind of like kind of hide away a little bit. And he's like, okay, all right, cool. Like, I'll go sit over here or whatever. But sometimes she's like, yes, I want, and then they give a hug each other. And so like, that's their way of giving a little bit of like recognition that I've done something hurtful to you. And then the last 2 are value empathy and develop agency. Value empathy, is just the work from Brene Brown. I'm not going to paraphrase her work here, but it's profound. And it really, it's so important that we think about this distinction between shame and empathy, and how our traditional systems of punishment have really kind of relied on shame as a motivator, when I think that the research is becoming increasingly clear that shame is a really toxic, and I mean that in a real sense of the word, like poison emotion, where you get this sort of spiral of eventual sort of self-harm, addiction, not feeling I'm good enough, even my relationship or my work or wherever, like I just not a good person. And that, like, if young people start to think themselves as not a good person, they stop trying to be good people. They start to say and self-narrate, like, I'm a bad kid, and there's nothing that nobody can do to change that. And so this is how it is. And they start to reinforce with their current behavior, this narration of like, I'm bad, that they've gotten when they were 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. And so we have to really interrupt that in this conflict space. And part of that way is through compassion. Part of that way is through connection. The flip side of shame is connection and empathy. And so that's just an essential part of how we need to sort of operate. And this is really important. I know we're talking about mostly about authors too, or kind of an audience of authors, but this is like essential, that when we're talking about restorative justice, we have to really recognize that kids and adults, I work with young people, do bad things. They do really bad things. They really hurt each other. Like we've had young people who have like had set a bathroom on fire. We've had a young person call in 3 felony bomb threats to a high school that I used to go to. Like, we've had some very bad behavior. Like, I mean, I'm couching it in really like minor language, but like, and so recognizing that, like, along with the empathy and the compassion and the other thing is like, this is your responsibility. And the flip side of that is agency. And so developing agency for young people is like, this is you. Like, I didn't go out there and start a fire. I didn't go get in a fight. I didn't punch this kid in the face. I wasn't tackling a bunch of other 5th graders on the football field. Like when we were supposed to be playing touch football, we're playing tackle football. This is you. So the agency really puts it on young people to say, like, this is your mess. I'm going to help you clean it up. But first of all, we got to recognize that this is your mess. And then second of all, we got to decide on like what you're going to do in order to make things better. And that kind of work is essential to allow young people the space to learn from these mistakes. And I know I can get on a soapbox here, but there's an additional piece here, which is in education, we consider like the problem solving, the active learning, internships, project-based learning is like real, sometimes deeper, more interesting learning for kids. You can learn more sometimes, and I would say often, from real world experiences than you can from academic reading or kind of worksheets and lectures even. And so when you go out and you do scientific research in a watershed and you're measuring mercury levels or acidity and looking at the population of salamanders, like that can be really powerful learning. In the same way that like when kids get into real knockdown drag out fights or bring drugs to school or get drunk on a field trip, like that, if we're not just throwing the kid out and we're actually just slowing down that process, that actually can be a really good opportunity for learning if we really put it on them and say, this is your mess. I didn't make this mess. You snuck off campus. You stole a bottle of wine from the grocery store. You came back drunk on our orientation. Like, now what do we do? And that's a real opportunity. And that's a real mind shift. It's a real mind shift to look at these like really big mistakes that kids make as an opportunity for learning. But that's a correlation between the sort of some of the project-based learning that we do in schools that we understand as good and like helpful, and some of the restorative work that young people can do in and around conflict can be really good and helpful and also change behavior.
Yeah, I mean, and you know what, as you're saying all these things, there's two different like kind of tracks going through my brain right now. So, as an educator who's, I've been in the field too, I know what it's like, but I mainly work with the younger grades. So as you're talking about these kids like stealing liquor, I'm like, well, my kids throw tantrums and they flip chairs over, dump toys, but they don't do that. But you can see that, it's very similar. Like there's an amount of, accountability that you want to put onto that child after doing that. Unfortunately, sometimes developmentally they're not ready for that accountability, they don't quite understand it, which you gave in a great example about how you mediate between your children. You kind of have to adapt it to benefit them, right? And understand it. The other track of what I was kind of thinking as you were saying that is that just like you need to adapt these kinds of teachings to younger children, you also very much so can just adapt it to the broader public too, which is something you mentioned to me in your email too, about how these principles and concepts go beyond just school and beyond just, it can go to the everyday person who doesn't even work with kids at all. So I want to dive a little bit into that, but also I just want to make the point that because your theories and ideas do that, it allows your book and your audience and your reach just expand so much more, because it's not just a niche. Like you now have this ability to make it accessible to everybody. So a little bit about how, like, if everyday Joe Schmo walks up to you and asks you like, what are the 5 pillars or something like that, like I mean, you know what I mean.
Well, yeah. I think the definition that we use, which is this really short, brief thing, which is like a relational approach to conflict, it resonates with people. And I think it's really easy to say, if we're thinking about disagreements or harm or whatever, like those people that you care about most, your parents, your siblings, your intimate partners, your wife, your husband, whomever, your own kids, like if we take those relationships and apply the same sort of structures that we do to schools, right? Timeouts, exclusion, isolation, we wouldn't have parents, we wouldn't have siblings, we would get divorced pretty quickly, and our kids do not like us. Right? Like that's the sort of approach that we typically do in schools, and that's what actually happens for young people who experience disconnection from the adults and their peers inside school, is that they feel like they don't belong, right? So the relational approach to conflict is holding two things at the same time. This is where it gets really hard, is because I want to tell my partner that I love her and care for her, and I'm not going anywhere. This is a safe place. And this thing that you're doing really bothers me. Like it's not just this really bothers me. And it's not just like I care about you. And we miss so much in most of our relationships, both of those things. We do one or the other. Like, stereotypical East Coasters, like real intense, and I tell you how it is, and I'll get up in your face and like do what kind of be assertive or aggressive almost in my demands for what I want. And that makes a lot of sense. And also there's some sort of stereotypes around like with the West Coast and super chill and like, oh, it's all good. It's all good. Things all good. It's like, well, actually, that's nice, but it's also not the whole truth. And so both of those things like need to exist at the same time, or in relation at least, right? It's not always at the same exact time, but like you need to sort of offer care and compassion and connection often, so that when you do like speak roughly or sarcastically to your spouse, that they're not like, this isn't the only experience they have. They actually have a lot of this other experience. And I heard this on Instagram. I follow a lot of parenting podcasts or, parenting folks. And this woman was responding to a question around, is it ever okay to yell at your kids? Mm-hmm. And she says, no. Like, great. Well, okay. So I've failed. Like, I have little kids. I've already yelled at them. Like, now what? Right. And I think that that's some of the work that Restorative Justice does and Restorative Systems is thinking about, if I continue to pour into this kind of part of the connection, of the relationship, of the trust, of the belonging, and then I lose my cool and I yell or I demand something happen right now, like stop touching the oven or get your hands off your sister or, put that knife or scissors down, because I'll do that and I'll say it really sharply. But this is connected to this other thing, right? It's not in isolation. I'm always trying to nurture this part of the relationship and the belonging and the trust. And so when it comes to like conflict and systems, when we're dealing with hard conversations around fights or, interpersonal conflict, your coworker, whomever, right? If you're trying to actually deal with something, then you want to address it with both of those things at the same time. So I spent 24 years in the Coast Guard Reserve, and so I've got a lot of military like stories. But this one guy like gets out of the military. It might be my uncle's story actually, but like goes into the corporate world and he capitalizes all of his emails, because in the military, for whatever reason, everything's capitalized. Like all the memos and all the stuff is like all caps. And so he goes into the civilian world and he capitalizes everything, and everybody feels like he's yelling at him. Yeah. Why are you yelling at us? Like, what is going on? We're talking about like the TPS reports or whatever. It's like, and so that kind of stuff, if you can go to somebody and say, hey, I'm just curious, this is how, this is what I'm seeing, or this is how it's feeling. I appreciate you. I really want you to be successful here. And then maybe you're a superior, you're talking to somebody who you just hired, trying to get some like clarity around culture in the business and the workspace. That's going to be really important around like, you belong here, and this thing doesn't work for us here. That's a sort of the back and forth. So when I think about how we translate restorative justice, like across the board to a lot of different settings, is like any place you have multiple relationships, like that's what we got to be doing. We got to think about how we're building relationships and engaging in the conflict at the same time. So yeah, I do want to answer that earlier question about the pre-K or younger.
I think it's like a side note a little bit, obviously I know some of the strategies, our listeners might not. We can dive into it a little bit if you'd like. I know we also have kind of an interesting topic to move on to next too. So
yeah, well, let's keep moving.
So my mysterious tone to all of our listeners right now is that Nicholas kind of hinted to me that he has a little bit of a surprise to tell us about. So without further ado, any more suspense, Nicholas, what's next on the horizon for you?
Yeah, we've done a bunch of different trainings and projects throughout the Northwest, and we have some partners in Kansas City. We travel a bunch, but in June we have our first Restorative Schools conference. So we've got some space at the Kennedy School, which is a McMenamins. I don't know if folks are familiar with McMenamins, but it's a huge staple out here in Portland and Seattle. A lot of very interesting spaces, but they took over this old school and turned it into a hotel and event space. And we have 150 spots for folks to come to Portland for a 2-day conference on restorative justice in schools. We actually have 2 really amazing keynote kind of presenters. We'll talk. You'll see more about the sort of structure on our website. But Joe Brummer and Mark Thornsberg from Australia they've collaborated and wrote, and maybe I can offer them some time with you as well, but they co-authored 2 books recently, Restorative Justice, Trauma-Informed Schools, from a sort of lens. I can't remember exactly the titles of their books off the top of my head, but it's Trauma-Informed Schools and How to Build Trauma-Informed Schools. So these 2 books that they wrote in the last 2 or 3 years, they'll both be on site with us in Portland. And I think really what's really valuable about our time is we're going to have a lot of big chunks of time with them and big chunks of time to learn from other folks, and really trying to take our restorative approach of relationships to heart and build that into the conference. So it's a pretty small conference in the grand scheme of things, but we're excited to host folks here in Portland this coming June 26th and 27th.
And that's coming up really soon too, like before you know it. I mean, it seems like June might be a while from now, but before you know it, you're going to blink and it's going to be summertime. And
yeah,
actually the ideal time, and I'm sure you planned it this way, right after school gets out, when anybody who this might be relevant to can hop right on over there.
Yeah, you don't have to take off time from school. Hopefully, you can just come on over, and hopefully your school will pay for it. And if not, we'd love to have you anyway.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely, you can, submit a proposal to your school. I know my current district, we did some training on trauma-informed schools not too long ago. I was trying to think, I'm like, did we study his book already? I'm gonna have to look and see, wait, this actually sounds really familiar, but maybe it's also because it's a very emerging trend.
Yeah.
Because your message really is widespread, and I mean, it's important, especially in the time and age that we are right now, for educators to get on board with this, or anybody really. I'm sure it's open to whoever's able to.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about some of the activities and things that we can expect. Is it offered on Zoom, for example, or is it in person?
It'll be in person only. There's just a principle that we want to do. We do offer some online courses. We do offer some remote trainings for schools and for districts around the country. But there's a lot that we like to do in person. And so those 150 people who are coming to Portland, we want to focus on them and really give them an experience. And so the additional thing that's different about this conference is going to be, you're going to be paired with one of our staff members who will help to facilitate a morning, afternoon, on both days, kind of both relationship building, but also some debriefing. So I'm hopeful that you'll be able to that folks will be able to learn from each other about both their experiences pre-conference, but also their experiences in the conference. So oftentimes you'll go to a conference and you'll be like, great, I get to go to one of these 6 things. Now what? So hopefully we'll be able to build some relationships and then also offer some learning, so people will get to share. And it actually helps us as participants really kind of, if we can say out loud what our takeaways were, what was interesting, it helps us encode that stuff in our brains so it sticks with us when we go back to our schools. The best way to learn something is to teach something, and that's sort of the idea.
I love that it's not only just about your trainings. We have opportunities for connection going on, and just opportunities for you to bring it back to your own lives and everyday work. So, I mean, back what I said about having a team is important. I mean, this is just another way to strengthen that team of yours too, which is a whole nother ballpark. It's really important stuff. So, I mean, I know at this point we're probably able to sign up and get on it. So if you're listening to this right now, head to, is there a specific website? Where do we sign up?
Yeah. So National Center for Restorative Justice.com/conference is the website. And if you're one of the first 50 people to register, then there's a little bit of a discount there. And if you're one of the other 100, you're certainly welcome to join at the full rate. So it does help if you get in there. And if you sign up for our newsletter, you'll get updates from us as well. So this should drop and be announced and be public on January 7th. And then this was likely after that. And so you should be able to go to National Center for Restorative Justice.com/conference, and you'll find it there.
Yes. Right now, everybody listening, literally pause our podcast right now, switch the tab over to this website, sign up, and then come back to us right after you do that. So give you a little bit of time, TikTok, go do that, and then come back. No, but it's really very serious stuff. So I really am looking forward to seeing how this all turns out. And you know what? As we get closer to the date, you can even hop back on and we can talk even more about it and get, more buzz going for it too, if you'd like, because that's, the more we can talk about this kind of thing, the more the message spreads and the more your impact will reach Nicholas. So it's always something we can do too, just as a thought.
That's great. I'd love to.
Yeah. So as we start to sort of wrap up everything here, I'm wondering if, you can take everything you've done, and because all of our listeners today are aspiring writers and, business leaders wanting to get their stories out, what piece of advice can you give to everybody based on your experiences with creating your book and, getting your message out? What's something we can leave our listeners with here today? What do you think?
I think when it comes to writing a book, I think you've got to do the work. Do the work first. I think the ideas come. I mean, that's different than fiction, right? Obviously, like, fiction's different than nonfiction. But when you're thinking about trying to offer ideas, I think it's important that you get in the trenches and do the work. And if you're thinking about, like, our next book will be about restorative justice and parenting, and sort of what the overlap is there, and sort of those different strategies for parenting, and that's different. But myself, I've got a lot of other dads in my circle who are in the restorative community, thinking about how we do this differently, how do we approach parenting differently. And so get in the trenches and do it. Do the teaching. If you want to be a consultant and want to talk about leadership, like, where are you leading and how are you leading there, in order to demonstrate the knowledge or the sort of expertise that you're offering to folks. If you're writing a book about rock climbing, right? I mean, you've got to be able to do this thing before you start writing about it. And I think that's part of it. And, sometimes there is in our culture, in our community, there's a lot of TikTok and a lot of Instagram kind of posts, and that's fine. And that's a good way to start. And then you start to refine your message. I offered a ton of different trainings, small, half day, 2 hour, 1 hour talks for years prior to writing this book. And so it turns into a 5-day long training if I put all my stuff together, and that's where we're at. And so the book is sort of a reflection of that 5-day training. That's actually really a reflection of the 3-day training, which we would need to write another book for those extra 2 days. That's another issue. So that's what I think. I think about, and then really start organizing those ideas into, like, categories, and start your spreadsheet, or however you're sort of organizing your ideas. It's a big Word doc or whatever you're doing, just starting to chunk that out. And I think the idea of, like, having discrete ideas is really important for me, and the way I was thinking about this work. That's why we've got 5 principles. We've got sort of equity in there, some strategies and tools, and those just tools and strategies are distinct. I can really speak to each one of them specifically. Yeah, that's what I think about. I'm also not a great writer. I'm dyslexic, so like, really hard for me to put the written word down. But I also had a really great co-author who was able to sort of work with me on that. So that was a blessing that I had.
Yeah, I mean, again, first off, you're not a bad author. There's no such thing. I mean, it's really just a matter of, once you have your ideas, you get it onto paper, and instead of saying you're a bad author, like, think back to your own pillars, right? Like, reframe the way you're thinking and find that support that we've been talking about this whole time. So,
yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, that's some amazing advice for anybody. Just do the work, really get into the field. Just like you can't write a book about rock climbing if you never rock climbed. Do you rock climb, Nicholas?
I don't, actually.
So I was about to be like, oh my God, we're climbing buddies, because I have a gym not too far from here that I used to go to a bunch. But
Nice.
yeah, just that's funny they threw that out there. Such like a niche thing to use.
Yeah.
But it makes sense and it's very relevant, right? Because you don't know what it's like unless you're actually living it too. I mean, you could do
Yeah,
a bunch of
yeah.
research, but you get the authenticity comes from living it and breathing it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, I get it. So I mean, all in all, what you're doing here is inspiring. As somebody else who's been in the field, I know what it's like to have children who, you know, you think their behaviors are just like, where is this coming from? How could you even, what in your mind made you do this certain thing, right? What you're doing is helping us to reframe that and also help them to reframe it in their own minds. And I think
Yeah,
that's just all in all entirely powerful. So thank you so much for all the work you're doing. I mean, it's going to make a huge impact, especially with your book out now that you can spread the word around. So
yeah.
yeah,
Thanks, Danielle. I appreciate it.
of course. With that, everybody, this wraps up our conversation for today. And Nicholas, I really just want to thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experience with us today. I mean, this book is, co-authored with David, like you said, but it's available now for everyone to take a look at and get an incredible roadmap for educators or anybody else who want to implement these restorative practices. And you can also find out more resources and information, like Nicholas said, and don't forget to sign up for the workshop in June because it's going to be something that everyone could benefit from. And, again, thank you so much for being another author to join us on Authors on Mission podcast. And to all of our listeners, if this conversation sparked your journey, remember that, your knowledge really does deserve to be shared, just like Nicholas's. Don't hold back. If you have a book idea in mind, reach out to us. We offer angel writing services, ghostwriting services, anything you can imagine. It's a done-for-you thing that makes even people who think that you might not be good at writing, like Nicholas mentioned, we have our support system to help you get your book out there. So with all of that, everybody, thank you for joining us. Nicholas, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. And until next time, everybody, and keep writing, keep leading, and keep inspiring. And have a great night. This is Danielle Hutchinson reminding you that somewhere, someone needs the book that only you can write. Visit authorsonmission.com to start your legacy. Until next time, keep leading, keep inspiring, and keep thinking in chapters. Have a great day.